student in urban planning under Professor Karel Martens. So my presentation is on dignity and looking at dignity and in the terms of gender. And so, yeah, so this is the title, Gender Gap. And let's see how we define dignity. So dignity can be defined in different ways. And the main one that people look at, and which is in a lot of legal documents, is from Immanuel Kant, and which looks at dignity as something that everyone possesses by their virtue of being human and also having rational autonomy. But there is another perspective or another way of looking at it that looks at people as, for those who don't have rational capacity, like people with cognitive disabilities, also maybe children or animals. So with this perspective, we look at something that Susie Kilmister, the theory of dignity looked at by Susie Kilmister, which is more on an interpersonal. So looking at how people relate with each other and that aspect of dignity. So the research objective is to examine how men and women in their diverse roles within the paratransit sector interact with each other and how they experience dignity. So paratransit in this instance is informal shared mobility, right? So here, maybe the example of the monetary route would be something similar. Or in New York, the dollar bands. Yeah, so it's informal in nature, informal routes, informal pricing, but also regulated. And the regulation ranges depending on the jurisdiction in which it's operating. So in this instance, my case study was in Nairobi, in Kenya, in East Africa, right? And Susie Kilmister defines it as being shaped by social norms and values. So how different people interact with each other. And it's, in that case, it becomes quite subjective because it changes from place to place. What is considered dignified in Israel in a certain small community might not be considered the same in a different one. So here we only look at that particular scope. Yeah. And so based on the theoretical framework of Susie Kilmister, she has 3 strands of dignity: the personal, the social, and the status. So the personal is very individual based on also where you come from, who you are, because we are shaped by our environment. And the personal could be something so simple as, let's say if you're a man and you have to shave before you leave the house. That is your personal dignity norm. And if you leave the house unshaved, you feel like you have not fulfilled your dignity, you're not dignified. Or if your shoes are not polished, if your hair is unkempt. So it depends on who you are and where you are, right? So then the social is based on your community. It's dictated by your community. So it could be religious, it could be a social club or something that dictates now how you perceive yourself, because you look at yourself through the eyes of the others, your peers, so to speak, yeah? But in a more social category. And the final one is status dignity. And how she talks about status dignity sometimes comes into the professional bodies. So maybe in your professional capacity as a lawyer or as a judge. So if a judge walks into a room, it doesn't matter how you perceive them on an individual basis, you will still have to rise up and say your honor, okay? And also status dignity, also it extends into if the state, what the state gives is required to give you based on your status as a citizen. So your rights and obligations also. So here in this instance, as I said, we had the study in Nairobi, which is in Kenya, and looking at the paratransit, right? And we had the 14 seaters, the 33 seaters, all the way up to the 58 capacity seaters of the informal shared mobility. And the data collection comprised of focus group discussions. So we had 9 focus group discussions, some that divided into gender, so men and women, and looking at the different operators. So in the paratransit, there's the driver, there's the conductor, the person who collects the money, and then, so that's the crew. And then also we looked at the users and 3 categories of users. So users who use it every day, like this is their basic, everybody uses it every day. And then those who occasionally use their vehicles. So maybe you use the paratransit on the weekdays and on weekends you use your personal car. And then those who predominantly walk, who form majority of the urban poor, who cannot afford to use public transport every day. Yeah. So these were the 3 categories of users, including the crew of the vehicles. And we had a manual thematic analysis, and during the focus groups, there were like 2 languages, and then also an informal colloquial language, like we call it Sheng. We had a pilot group, one with persons with disabilities, which is a mixed group, a car dominant of 7 people, which is also mixed, the paratransit dependent, which is mixed, walking dominant, also mixed, then the drivers, male, female, conductors, male and female. So in terms of the findings, what we saw was in terms of being able to uphold or to live your personal dignity or your personal norms is very much dependent on your gender, right? So a lot of things, it was easier for men because men in this profession were more respected. So it was very uncommon for women to be in this space because it's considered a very male-dominated space, and they were not welcome in this environment. So they had to kind of adapt and also stifle their personal values, right? Maybe look a certain way and behave in a different way outside their norm. So the men were also very proud of their profession. So they were able to.
Just a comment. Once you finish, please directly go to the other room. They're waiting for you.
Okay, right, thank you. I'm almost done. Right?
Take your time.
That's really, I am almost done. So I did that. So the men never had to hide the fact that this was their profession. So they were able to also uphold themselves in a certain way in society. But the women would have to kind of, once they're at work, they have their uniform, and then when they're off, they don't want to be associated with the job. And female crew members and passengers had to exercise extreme politeness, right? So there was a lot of hostility towards them. And especially, it was a profession not very much welcome to women. And there were many insults, especially the usual, where I don't know if people always refer to calling them prostitutes. So this was something that they also encountered a lot. And they would have to kind of not react in any way or speak out against something that bothers them, so as to maintain some peace, because also there's sometimes people would be violent, tend to be violent towards them. Yeah, so one of the quotes was a lady who said, I choose not to engage because also you cannot fight with them. You're not going to start fighting with people and lose a job. And there was also a tension between personal dignity and systemic constraints. So the environment of informality also has a lot of, it's not well regulated. And so within such a system, there's a lot of corruption. And if it's against your personal norms to participate in corruption, you cannot, because it's a system. So you have to participate in it. So they could not live out their personal values or go against it. You had to kind of toe the line, right? So somebody here says, I'm uncomfortable with bribing, it goes against my personal values, but you have to do it within the system. Otherwise you cannot operate, okay? In terms of social dignity, which is now the group category, yeah, which is mirroring what you get your dignity from your peers. And here we see that there were negative perceptions on paratransit labor as a whole, yeah. So there was the assumption that a lot of them are uneducated. That's why they were this is the only job that you could get. Yeah, you're just a driver or you're just a conductor, because also the qualifications were quite low to get into such a profession. So there was a lot of negative stereotypes towards them. So already in terms of the social ladder, they were quite, or the hierarchy, they were quite low, considered quite low. And also there was quite a lot of patriarchy within the space, yeah? So the ascribed roles that we would mirror in society, where it's quite patriarchal, would also play themselves out within the transport space, yeah? So now here is the example of the insults that the women face, because in the home, in the social category, as a woman in the home, you're respected because you're a homemaker, you're a mother, whatever role you serve. But you take this out and put it in a space that does not welcome women, then you are seen very, very lowly, and people would actually verbalize that towards them, yeah? And also there was a hierarchy of crews and users mirrored in the social values. So the customer is always right, yeah? So there was no protection, labor protection for this social category of workers, yeah? So they are not really considered professionals at all. So it doesn't matter what altercation happens within the vehicle, the owners of the vehicle always sided with their clients, yeah? So demoralizing them more and also lowering their social value and hence their social dignity. And finally, the socio-economic standing takes the experiences of various actors within the transport system. So people feel like their humanity is also taken away from them, yeah? So, and how people interact, people who had vehicles and only occasionally used the paratransit came into the space in a very, feeling very superior to those who have to use it every day. So it was kind of their way to go in and see how the others live. And for them, it was taken even as an experience. And you would hear people saying this, oh yeah, when I want to interact with the people, I use the paratransit, yeah, just to see how they are and what's happening on the ground. Yeah. So there was kind of a dismissive tone in that. It's for poor people. So in terms of status dignity, violations would happen when recognition respect is not upheld in the transport space. So recognition, the recognition respect is the respect that comes with being a part of a group, like if you are a transport worker. So you're given that recognition respect of being a professional. Yeah. So there was one where a lot of people so the unwritten rule that the front seats were reserved for ladies. So men who would imagine themselves in a patriarchal society to be very high, and then they find that the best seats in the vehicle are given to women, it kind of diminishes their value. So I'm supposed to be respectable in every sphere, but in this sphere where there's a reservation for women, you're like, why can't I get that seat that I want? Yeah, so there was kind of a clash with how they perceive themselves. And also reputation vulnerabilities and coping strategies. So people would kind of, as a coping mechanism, they would kind of dump themselves down and assume that those dignity violations didn't really bother them. And also there was a clear power imbalance and lack of trust in the institutions because it's informal. If you have any complaint, there's really nowhere that you can take it, yeah? And also looking at the paratransit crew as very unrowdy, uncouth, because you've already labeled them uneducated, yeah? So it kind of diminishes them even further, and they take it on themselves to act that way, yeah? Because you've already dismissed me, so I will just give you what you expect, yeah? So also there was a feeling of among conductors that they were at the lowest level because they required there were no real entry requirements. All they needed to do was not have a criminal record. Yeah, so the drivers would have a higher qualifications. You need to be able to drive. You need to be able to drive a certain class of vehicle also. So yeah, so that diminished them in how they perceive themselves as professionals, and they didn't see themselves as such, and also it was mirrored by society. So what are the outcomes or key insights? There is a clear paratransit hierarchy, which is patriarchal, which mirrors the society, of course, because it's just a microcosm of what is going on. And right at the top were the male drivers, and all the way at the bottom were the female conductors, right? And elements of dignity, what contributed significantly to that, yeah? So gender, so being masculine pushed you higher up. Then marital status, married men were trusted more to be drivers. Yeah, so you felt like you could give your vehicle to, if you're leasing out your vehicle, it's better to give it to a man who is married, who has a family, because he's more responsible, ultimately. And also the social economic aspect, those who have cars, access to alternatives, and at the lowest level where the urban poor who mostly walked and occasionally would be able to afford this, yeah, to use transit. And also level of education, as I said, especially among the crews who are considered to be uneducated, dropouts, and they were treated in a very negative, and their dignity was always violated in how they were spoken to. Then the informality of the system, where there are no checks and balances, no reporting mechanisms, also impacted and intensified the dignity violations, because what are you going to do about it, right? So it had a cascading effect. So if your dignity is violated, you look for the next person you can step on and go ahead with that. And also a lot of gender stereotypes and social norms, obviously disproportionately affected women. Yeah, so in terms of future research and recommendations, professionalization, policy review and evaluation of what currently exists, and then individuals' alternatives for low-income groups, enforcement of existing policies, and also having standardization, because as I said, like there's a lot of jurisdictional differences in terms of the regulation. It depends on where it's operating. And a behavioral and cultural change interventions, because also this becomes quite something that is social norms, and it needs to have a place where it's being, like, the intervention has to come from there, from the society. And also looking at comparative studies, looking at dignity, because dignity does not look the same in every place. Like in an urban area, in a rural area, in a religious community, it's all different, And also like quantitative methodologies to measure and have tools that can measure dignity. And evaluation of policy. Great. Thank you for your time.